2. A philosophic perspective. The Deutsch-Französische Jahrbuch was therefore a stillborn child. Once it became clear that its editors could not work together permanently, then it mattered little when and how they separated. In fact, an early breach was preferable to a later one. It was enough that Marx himself should have taken a great step forward along the path to a clear view of things. He published 2 contributions in the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbuch, an introduction to a critique of the Hegelian philosophy of law, and a notice of 2 books which Bruno Bauer had published on the Jewish question. Despite the different matter with which these 2 contributions deal, they are very closely connected in ideological content. Later Marx summed up his criticism of the Hegelian philosophy of law in the declaration that the key to an understanding of historical development must be sought in society, which Hegel disdained, and not in the state, which he praised. In the second contribution he deals with this viewpoint in still greater detail than in the first. From another angle the 2 contributions are related to each other as means and end. The first gives a philosophic outline of the proletarian class struggle, whilst the second gives a philosophic outline of socialist society. However, neither the one nor the other appeared extemporaneously, rather, both indicate the intellectual development of their author in a strictly logical order. The first contribution proceeded directly from Feuerbach, who had completed the criticism of religion, the hypothesis of all criticism, in its essentials. Man makes religion, religion does not make man. Man, begins Marx, is not an abstract being existing outside the world. Man is the world of men, the state, society, a world which has produced religion as an inverted world consciousness because it is an inverted world. The struggle against religion is therefore indirectly the struggle against that world whose spiritual aroma is religion. Thus it becomes the task of history to establish the reality of the world, since the reality of heaven has disappeared. The criticism of heaven thus turns into a criticism of earth, the criticism of religion into a criticism of law, the criticism of theology into a criticism of politics. For Germany, however, this historical task can be performed only by philosophy. If one negatives the conditions in Germany in 1843, one finds that, according to French historical computation, the year 1789 has hardly been reached, still less the focus of contemporary problems. If modern politico-social reality is to be subjected to criticism, then criticism finds itself outside of German reality or it would fail to reach its real object. As an example of the fact that up to then German history had, like a clumsy recruit, only the task of performing the same old wearisome drill, Marx mentions one of the chief problems of modern times. The relation of industry, of the world of wealth in general, to the political world. This problem occupies the Germans in the form of protective tariffs, prohibitory duties, the system of national economy. The Germans are thus beginning where the English and the French are ending. The old and rotten conditions against which these countries are theoretically in rebellion and which they tolerate only as one tolerates chains, are being welcomed in Germany as the rising sun of a rosy future. Whilst in France and England the problem is political economy or the dominance of society over wealth, in Germany it is national economy or the dominance of private property over nationality. In the one case it is a question of untangling the knot, and in the other one of first tying it. Although they are not historical contemporaries of other nations, the Germans are philosophic contemporaries. The criticism of the German philosophy of law and the state, which has received its most logical form in the hands of Hegel, leads directly into the center of these burning questions of the day. Marx then clearly defines his attitude both to the 2 tendencies which had existed side by side in the Renaissance and to Feuerbach. Feuerbach had thrown philosophy onto the scrap heap, but if one wished to deal with really vital matters, one must not forget, points out Marx, that up to the present the really vital life of the German people had flourished in its skull only. To the cotton barons and iron magnates he declares, "You are quite right to demand the liquidation of philosophy, but you cannot liquidate it without first having realized it." And to his old friend Bruno Bauer and the latter's followers he declares on the contrary, "You are quite right to demand the realization of philosophy, but you cannot realize it without liquidating it." The criticism of the philosophy of law resolves itself into tasks for which there is only one means of solution: practice. How can Germany raise itself to a practical level à la hauteur de principes, that is to say, to a revolution which will not only raise it to the level of the modern peoples, but to that human level which will be the immediate future of these peoples? How can it turn a single somersault not only over its own limitations, but at the same time over the limitations of the modern peoples? limitations which it must in reality feel to be an emancipation from its own limitations, and which it must itself seek to attain. The weapon of criticism can certainly not supplant the criticism of weapons. Material force must be overthrown by material force, but theory itself becomes a material force when it takes hold of the masses, and it does so immediately it becomes radical. However, a radical revolution needs a passive element, a material basis. Theory is realized in a people only to the extent of that people's needs. It is not enough that the idea should press forward to realization, reality itself must urge toward the idea. This would seem to be lacking in Germany, where the various spheres of society are related not dramatically, but epically. Where even the moral confidence of the middle class is based solely on the consciousness that it is the general representative of the Philistine mediocrity of all other classes. Where each sphere of bourgeois society suffers its defeat before it has celebrated its victory, and shows its narrow-mindedness before it has had a chance of showing its broad-mindedness, so that each class is involved in a struggle with the class below it before it can engage in a struggle with the class above it. However, this does not prove that radical revolution, general human emancipation, is impossible in Germany. It proves only the impossibility of a merely political revolution, a revolution which would leave the pillars of the house standing. The preliminary conditions for such a political revolution are lacking in Germany. On the one hand, a class which from its own particular situation undertakes the general emancipation of society, even though only on the assumption that the whole of society faces the same situation as this class. That is to say, that it possesses, for instance, money or education, or can obtain them at its pleasure. And on the other hand, a class in which all the defects of society are concentrated, a particular social sphere which is held responsible for the notorious crime of the whole of society, so that emancipation from this class appears as the general self-emancipation of society. The negative general significance of the French aristocracy and the French clergy conditioned the positive general significance of the immediately contiguous and opposing class, the bourgeoisie. From the impossibility of a half-revolution, Marx concludes the possibility of a radical revolution. Asking where this possibility exists, he answers, in the formation of a class with radical links, a class of bourgeois society which is not a class of bourgeois society. This class must represent the dissolution of all classes. It must be a sphere of society of universal character as a result of its universal suffering, demanding no particular right, because no particular wrong has been done to it, but only wrong as such. It must no longer be able to appeal to a historical title, but to a human title only. It must no longer merely stand in a one-sided contradiction to the consequences, but in general and all-round contradiction to the very hypotheses of the German state. Finally, it must be of such a nature that it cannot emancipate itself at all without emancipating itself from all other spheres of society, thus emancipating them at the same time. In a word, there must be a complete forfeiture of man as he is, compelling an equally complete rebirth of a new humanity. This dissolution of society is the proletariat. It began to develop in Germany as the Industrial Revolution swept over the country, for it was formed not by natural but by artificial poverty. Not by the masses crushed by the mere weight of society, but by the masses resulting from the acute dissolution of society, chiefly the dissolution of the middle classes. Although gradually and as a matter of course the naturally poor and the Christian Germanic serfs entered the ranks of these masses. As philosophy finds its material weapons in the proletariat, so the proletariat finds its intellectual weapons in philosophy. And as soon as the lightning of thought has struck deep into the mass of the common people, the emancipation of the Germans into human beings will take place. The emancipation of the Germans is the emancipation of man. Philosophy cannot be realized without the liquidation of the proletariat. The proletariat cannot liquidate itself without realizing philosophy. When all the inner conditions have been fulfilled, the day of German resurrection will be announced by the crowing of the Gallic chanticleer. Judged both by its form and its content, this article is in the front rank of all those youthful writings of Marx which have been preserved. A short sketch of the basic ideas contained in it cannot give even an approximate idea of the overtowering richness of thought which Marx masters in such epigrammatic and concise form. And those German professors who found its style grotesque and its manner in appalling taste have thereby borne no inglorious testimony against themselves. However, even Rouhet found its epigrams too artificial. He criticized its formlessness and superform, but discovered in it a critical talent developing into dialectic, but occasionally degenerating into brashness. This is not unfair criticism, for the youthful Marx sometimes exulted in the mere swish of his sword through the air, though in action it proved sharp and heavy enough. Arrogance is the dowry of all talented youth. However, the philosophic perspective into the future which this article opens up is still far off. No one has proved more conclusively than the later Marx that no nation can at a single bound leap over the necessary stages of its historical development. But though the perspectives he sketched in this article were shadowy, they were not incorrect. In detail many things have come about differently, but on the whole they have come about as he prophesied. Both the history of the German bourgeoisie and that of the German proletariat are his vindication.